Okay, so good morning, everyone, and welcome to our session today. My name is Alicia Gallier. I'm Business Development Manager at One Nucleus. Thank you for joining this morning's session on the topic of what have Brexit and COVID-19 meant when recruiting EU citizens to UK life science jobs. So the concept of this event came about as One Nucleus is looking to support its members now that the Brexit plans are progressing, but also recognising that we are starting to emerge from the pandemic. And perhaps there are some questions around what employees are feeling and how employers should respond and deal with that to ensure that staff are happy and retention rates are good. So the objectives for this session are to cover the current immigration landscape and what employers should do now when recruiting from Europe, to look at opportunities and challenges for life science businesses, with some examples that have been felt by employers. And then also what changes we should be anticipating, both in terms of employment practicalities, but also in terms of what employees will now be seeking when they're thinking about their sort of work-life balance and potentially location of work. Just going to admit some more people, thank you. So taking part in our session today, we have, I'm delighted that we have Alex Russell, who is Partner for Employment and Immigration at Mills & Reeve. Alex will be presenting first on the current rules and guidance. This will be followed by Michael Miller, who is HR Development Manager, and Kaushika Bassett-Shand, who is HR Coordinator at Signature Discovery. And they will follow on with a case study and some examples of their experiences to date. And following this, we're hoping it will stimulate some debate. So we've reserved some time for open Q&A. So if throughout the presentations, you do have questions, please do use the chat box to drop those in, or if you'd like to wait until the end, no problem. And then you're probably aware that we are also recording the session today. Before we go into the first half of the presentations, I'm just going to conduct a poll just to see who we have in terms of the audience. So I'm just going to launch this poll now. So it's just to sort of gauge the experience of the audience today. So you can see the question up on the screen, hopefully. So to what extent has Brexit impacted your business's ability to recruit? So we'd be interested to see the experience of the audience online today. So I'll give you a few moments. I can see the votes coming in. That's brilliant. Thank you very much. And then I'll share the results. That's pretty much everyone. Brilliant stuff. So I'm going to end the poll now. Interesting results. So then I will share those results. So for the benefit of the recording, because they don't show up. So we've got 22% significantly negative, 57% slightly negative, and 22% no impact. So I don't know if any of the speakers want to comment on those results. Any surprise or no surprise?
I think that is interesting. I mean, I'll pick up on some of the points that come out of that when I speak in a moment. But I think it does reflect the fact that whilst there are some negatives, actually it's not all negative for the sector across sort of pharma, life sciences, academia. So yeah, that's interesting.
Thanks, Alex. Michael, Kaushika, any comments or thoughts?
I think that's probably consistent with our viewpoint and experience as well. Certainly, things could have been worse. Perhaps we might have preferred it if they were different, but we've been able to hopefully make the most of the opportunities that it's brought still.
Excellent. Thank you. So I'll stop sharing those now. Okay, so thanks all for taking part in that quick poll. And with that, Alex, I'm going to hand to you to deliver your presentation. So over to you when you're ready.
Great, thanks very much. Let me just share my screen. I'm sure you'll let me know if that's not coming through.
That looks great, yeah.
Great, brilliant. Well, yeah, great to be with you. Thanks very much for for the invite. Those of you that don't know me, I'm a partner at Mills & Reeves, so I head up our national immigration team, and it's definitely true to say that I think the past year or so has been one of the most challenging periods for businesses, employers, and indeed advisors, just to keep track of what's going on with the combined sort of impact of Brexit, the ending of free movement, a new immigration system, and then overlaying that the complexities of Covid-19, all the various concessions that have happened, the impact on movement. It's been a challenging time, which I'm sure many of you have experienced. Just keeping up with what's actually going on day to day is not always straightforward in itself. If you'd like to connect with me on LinkedIn, please do. It'd be great to do so. There's the QR code if you'd like to. And obviously, you can find me if you can't make use of that QR code now. So I thought what I'd do is just spend 15 minutes really just thinking in fairly big picture terms on where we are in terms of the movement of people, thinking about the immigration and visa landscape at the moment, where also that might be heading, some of the key practical points at the moment, and also I think thinking really in large part about the opportunities that are out there. I think sometimes with this topic, quite understandably, we can feel quite sort of negative about what's going on, but I think there are opportunities out there. I think that probably is reflected in the 79% in that poll that said only slightly impacted or no impacted. No impact in terms of the ending of free movement. So hopefully, yeah, we'll pull out some of those opportunities and give you a little bit of food for thought as we kind of all go back to our roles. I'm conscious we've got a really mixed group today, from universities through to pharma businesses, biotech businesses. So hopefully there's something here for everyone as we go through. As I say, I thought it'd be useful just to start really by thinking, well, kind of where are we in the post-Brexit landscape? Obviously, the ending of EU free movement is a huge change, probably one of the biggest changes for several decades to our immigration landscape. But I think it's probably fair to say that the most of the impact around that, or at least the most serious impact, is more around what we term sort of the lower skilled, the lower paid or deemed lower skilled, lower paid roles. And actually for higher skilled sectors, like obviously what we're in, perhaps the impact isn't as significant. It's inconvenient, it's annoying, it's not as easy to move people around, but perhaps not quite as significant as it could be. And I'll look at that in terms of some of the new visa routes that have opened out as a result of that. Essentially, although we've now got a flat across the board immigration system, what essentially we've had is the ending of the downward pressure on numbers, which has always had to be exerted through the visa system because of free movement. Some of that's been liberalised and made more flexible, and for higher skilled and skilled roles, actually it's a bit easier for employers to be able to recruit people that they need, which is good news. Obviously, there are lots of concerns. I know that I think 57% I was reading of papers come from international collaborations, for example, research papers. What's going to be the practical impact on collaborations with the ending of free movement? I'm not saying there's no problems there, but it's perhaps a more nuanced picture than might first meet the eye. I think the rhetoric versus reality point is also quite interesting. I think, or at least the perception of what the government's rhetoric is. I think there is a difference between what the government sometimes says, or the impression it likes to create about immigration policy, and what actually it does in practice. And as we'll see with the new routes that we've got, actually, I think there is a genuine agenda out there to try and facilitate life sciences businesses, technology businesses, these sorts of sectors to be able to get the people that they need more easily and to enable collaborations. And that's often not what comes out in the popular media. It's sometimes not even what the government actually says in its own announcements, because it's got so many stakeholders it's having to play to. But again, I think the picture often isn't quite as negative as we might imagine it to be. We'll look at the new immigration routes and the direction of travel. I think there are also kind of bigger drivers at play at the moment, which are quite interesting. It's going to remain to be seen, won't it, what the impact of COVID-19 will be on long-term patterns of work. There's lots of stuff out there about Generation Y, what they expect in terms of how they want to work, the fact that people are going to be evidencing more easily that they can work remotely and flexibly, and that's not a problem, and that could be the case internationally as well. So we're probably in a fluid situation where there's going to be changes, different expectations, and a system having to adapt to that. think over the months and years ahead, it could be quite a watershed moment. I think for the sector. So with that in mind, I thought I'd just touch on the visa landscape for life sciences. And I was reflecting that when I first started doing immigration work, a decade or more ago, it really was a very narrow and difficult environment that I think businesses had to work within. You essentially had what was the old tier 2 visa for specific job offers with specific employers, and that was basically it. Now post-Brexit, we've got a much more varied landscape. There are more routes, there's more flexibility, less onerous criteria. And I've put really the main categories that are there on the slide. And I think one of my observations would be that I don't think many employers are making as effective use of these different routes as perhaps they might be able to do so, or at least not using the most advantageous routes. We've obviously got, haven't we, the main skilled worker visa that replaced the old tier 2 visa, the sponsored visa. You're a sponsor, you have a license, you sponsor somebody for a specific role. Some really significant changes though with that category, as I'm sure you've picked up, compared with the old tier 2 category. So we've got a reduction in the skill level that qualifies for the visa. So it's gone down from what they call RQF level 6, a kind of graduate level role, down to RQF level 3, a deemed A-level skill level role. And what that does, it brings into play a huge number of roles that weren't previously open for sponsorship. So for example, laboratory technicians, lab technicians, a key role for the sector, not previously able to get visas because of the change in skill level. They are now in principle in scope for visas. Also a change with that to the salary threshold. So there's much more flexibility around that. You can earn points for salary through a combination of things like PhD qualifications. That's obviously particularly relevant for science roles, even lab technician type roles, or for being on the shortage occupation list, which many of the roles that we have are on, or indeed by being somebody who's under 26 or switching from the student visa. So much lower salary thresholds, again, bringing a lot more roles into play than used to be the case. And counterintuitively, an ending of that requirement to have to be advertising for roles in a prescribed manner before you can recruit international staff. So the old resident labour market test that many of you will be familiar with has gone. No requirement to do that, full access to the global labour market, no constraints on that essentially. So again, much more flexibility, less onerous requirements, more straightforward in most cases to recruit international staff. So lots of positives, I think, with that visa route, which are really encouraging. But I think there are other routes for life sciences businesses, for higher education institutions that are really significant, and I've put them there on the slide. So the global talent visa, which I'm sure some of you have already made use of, is a huge development. It came into force last February, underwent changes last December. It's a non-sponsored route, really favourable for individuals. They get to settlement in the UK more quickly and gives people much more flexibility in terms of what they do in the UK. So they can be employed by multiple employers, have fingers in different research pies, perhaps also be running a spin-off company, which they're a director of and earning from. So in the sorts of sector that we're in, the people that we're engaging with, this is a real really valuable route that's open. So in the university sector, obviously it enables researchers and senior academics to essentially be automatically endorsed for the visa, so they can automatically get it. But it's been expanded as well over the past year or so. So there are lots of organisations now that if they're an endorsed funder by UKRI, then they can be sponsored they can obtain an endorsement for the work that they're doing, be hosted by an eligible institution approved by UKRI, which some of you will be, and undertake that research with the institution. So much more flexibility, less compliance and cost for employers, a really great option. And I think in many sectors, particularly the academic sector, that is going to start to become what I'd say is the default visa category for many staff, rather than perhaps the sponsored skilled worker category. I mean, other changes, the temporary worker route that we've always had, but which has been expanded post-Brexit. So some of you will have government authorised exchange temporary worker licenses. That's been expanded out to include UKRI endorsed research organisations. Again, you can hold licenses and sponsor people for that temporary worker route, really significant. So for supernumerary roles, research roles, people linked to research grants, you can come into the UK for up to 2 years to work and be employed. Sources of funding can be variable overseas, different research bodies, the employer itself. So huge flexibility for short-term supernumerary research. And I would say always worth looking at, is that an option that is possible for the sorts of roles that we're looking at? And it's going to be expanded. So only yesterday, there was talk, wasn't there, of the Australia-UK trade deal, and effectively the ability for Australian nationals, it seems, to be able to come to the UK up to age 35 to work for up to 2 years at a piece under that deal, an expansion of what some of you will know as being the Youth Mobility Scheme. And then people can switch into, for example, a skilled worker visa or the global talent visa. So we're going to see those sorts of routes, I think, increasingly tied to UK trade deals, particular carve-outs for particular countries. We've got a new graduate route coming in from the 1st of July. That's for international students, where they can post-study work for 2 years or 3 years, depending on their level of study, for any employer. No minimum skill level, no salary requirements. So it's a great try before you buy option, I think, for the sector. So kind of new keen graduates moving into research positions, science roles. This is a really great route where you don't have to sponsor, you don't have the cost of administration and risk of that. See how they are, perhaps get them through probation, and then look to move them into one of the more substantive skilled worker, for example, routes at longer term. There's a frontier worker category that enables EU staff based in the EU but working from time to time in the UK to be able to come in to do that. That's significant. And the visitor route that I'll touch on in a moment. So the short-term route, usually up to 6 months, to enable people to come into the UK for meetings, site visits, signing contracts, gathering information relating to research overseas, those sorts of things. Those are the main routes at the moment. So it's a really, as I say, richer picture, I think, in terms of the options that are available for the sector. I think my question would be, are you making as effective use of that as you can be in your organisations? Are you making good use of global talent for research or academic roles? Might temporary worker be an option in some cases? And you're going to see more people presenting as the months go on with leave that will enable them to take up roles without you having to sponsor them, like the graduate route leave. So a really interesting picture. One of the points that I thought I'd touch on practically is around the issue of travel, because I know that's a really significant point for many of us, just navigating that short term, people coming in and out of the UK, going to the EU. And I've put the main details there on the slide. EU nationals can come into the UK as visitors. They don't need visas to do so in advance. They're called non-visa nationals. They can come up to 6 months per visit to do limited permissible activities like meetings, interviews, site visits, gathering information relating to research overseas. Potentially some collaborations with overseas organisations would come within that. They can't do paid substantive work in the UK, but that's a route that is open and available. So not too sticky, if you like, for EU nationals wanting to come into the UK short term for that. A key practical tip, I would say, is to always issue invite letters to people if they're coming into work or do activities with you. That's because it minimises the risk of them being refused entry at a border clearance. They can just show the letter, and also just leaves a bit of a paper trail for you in the event of some sort of challenge. I think the other point on this is obviously the fact that Brexit is a two-way street, as many people are finding out to their cost. And obviously British nationals going to the EU face additional constraints. You can have up to 90 days in any 180-day period to the Schengen countries to do visit type activities. So those things like meetings, presenting papers, collaborations. You've got to be careful beyond that. When people start to stray into substantive activities in another country, you'd want to be thinking about, well, what are the visa issues in that country? There's no uniform European-wide visa system. It depends on the individual country's rules. So checking that out is going to be really important. And practicalities, remember things like e-hit cards, European health insurance cards, you can't get new ones, getting travel insurance in place, driving licenses, all those sorts of things are not as simple as they used to be. So I think messaging for staff who are heading out to the EU is really key. Final few points from me, I'm conscious of time, is around some right to work issues. This has been a really live issue for many people. around what do we do with EU nationals. Do remember we've got a new system coming into play from the 1st of July on checking right to work for EU nationals who are joining us as new employees. It's no longer the case that they can just start on the basis of an EU national passport. You're going to have to be doing checks that go beyond that. The new code of practice has been published. Essentially, it's going to be around evidence of status under the EU settlement scheme or another visa of some kind, or some sort of pending application like under the EU settlement scheme. There's been much talk, hasn't there, about the right to work checks and how those have been adjusted in light of COVID-19. So at the moment, you can do them over a screen rather than face-to-face in person. When is that going to come to an end? At the moment, the government guidance is still saying we're going to be from the 21st of June, reversing back to business as usual, the face-to-face checks or the online checking portal. Query whether, given the changes to the guidance for what employers should be doing on remote working, that will again get pushed back until the date in July, but we haven't had confirmation of that. It's being lobbied on hard. Nothing has come through to me yet through the networks that we are involved with. There are potentially sticky areas here, I think, around the timing of checks. How's it going to work with different categories of staff? If it comes to your attention that staff in future that joined before the end of June this year, it comes to light they didn't have the right visa in the UK. There are some sticky issues there potentially to work through, but the bottom line is you don't have to do retrospective checks on staff that have joined on the basis of an EU passport up to the 30th of June. The new system kicks in from the 1st of July, and you should be able to rely on the checks that you conducted before the 30th of, or up to the 30th of June for people who started employment on or before that date. And there's no requirement to do retrospective full face-to-face checks for people that you did that adjusted screen check for in that period. Do keep an eye on the various green, amber, red country rules on people coming into the UK. I have come across a few businesses that have had problems with that. People haven't bought the right quarantine package or haven't recognised they've come through a red country in the past 10 days and so forth. Those rules, are there, well published on, well publicised on gov.uk, but make sure you keep up to speed with those for people that are coming into the UK to work with you or visit on some project, for example. And what I would say is this is all a very fluid landscape. So what we've not had is a system where there's been an immigration system pre-Brexit, we've got a new system post-Brexit, and that's it. I think it's going to be a system that changes regularly. There are regular tweaks. It's designed to be more fluid, responding to the needs, particularly of sectors like life sciences, technology, where we're seen as being at the forefront of the drive for kind of the growth, productivity, putting the UK at the forefront of development. So I think we are going to see various tweaks that are favourable to the sector. Some of the things that are talked about on the horizon is, could we have a new points-based visa for highly skilled migrants again? Let's talk about introducing that in the March of next year. So again, probably a streamlined category. Talk of a global mobility visa, so for international businesses, a more fluid system, streamlined to enable people to move people around an international business and network without having to meet onerous requirements. I know certainly with lots of the clients that I work with, at the moment, the system's just not great for that. Moving people into the UK short term from an overseas group company or operation is not easy. And those of you who deal with sponsorship systems and sponsor people on the sponsor management system, they're currently trialing a new portal. You'll be pleased to know, because the current portal is basically a shambles, isn't particularly effective or easy to navigate. That could well be rolled out in 2022. I wouldn't hold my breath. Home Office technology development is not always particularly swift, but there is talk about that new interface and portal coming into play at some point next year. So that's probably enough from me for now, but I'm sure that we'll have questions later on that we can pick up after the next chunk of the presentation.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Alex, for sort of highlighting the kind of breadth of options available in terms of routes coming in. That was really interesting to see. And then perhaps some more of the other areas that employers need to be aware of, as you said, sort of the sticky areas. So yeah, really interesting. And hopefully we can pick up on some more of those points after the next presentation from Michael and Kaushika. So I think, Michael, you're going to be sharing, so I'll hand over to you then. Over to you, thanks.
Okay, hopefully that's worked properly there.
Yep, looks good.
Thanks again, Alex, for sharing all that information with us. Certainly a few bits there which we'll want to think about a bit more carefully. I think what we've tried to do here with these slides is give people a bit more of a concrete example of how a business has fared over the last year or so, both considering Brexit and also possible impacts of the pandemic. Hopefully that gives us a little bit more to think about and apply some of the principles that Alex was just talking to us about. To be clear, we certainly don't see ourselves as the authority on such things. Hopefully just a useful example of how we have coped. But to get us going, a little bit about Signature in general. We were founded in 2004, so relatively well established at this point, and we offer fully integrated drug discovery services as a CRO. Our focus is always on quality, and that has generally seen a very high level of repeat business, which reassures us that we've pitched that at the right level there. And we have got a large number of employees at the moment, more than 440 of them, and they're over 2 different sites. The larger one is in Nottingham, and there's also one at Audley Park at the old AstraZeneca site. And an awful lot of our employees work within the chemistry department, which is especially relevant for how we've been having to adapt to changes with the pandemic recently, and that it is generally very difficult to do chemistry from home. So we've had to do a lot to try and make sure it was safe for people to work on site. We've consistently seen a pretty high level of growth, which has required a lot of work on the recruitment front, and also a degree of pressure on ensuring that people didn't leave, or at least not into greater numbers. And so we've carved up the rest of our segment into 2 halves, focusing both on the recruitment side of things and also on the retention side, which I think is probably more relevant for some of the impact of the pandemic there as well. So I shall just move on to the next slide, and Kaushika is the one who is closest to our recruitment side of things. She does an awful lot of interviews each week and has dealt with, I suspect, some of the more fiddly and challenging elements of government portals that Alex alluded to earlier as well. So I'll just hand over to her for now.
Thank you, Michael.
There we go.
Yeah, definitely the news of a new, well, potentially a new SMS system is music to my ears. So won't hold my breath, Alex, but that's good news. So as Michael said, I work a bit closer to the recruitment and currently the level 1 user on the visa SMS system. So looking after the current visa applications that we have. So first, I just start with attracting candidates in a Brexit landscape. So for us, what has been crucial to this has been our sponsorship license to continue to attract a wide pool of candidates to recruit from the EU and rest of the world as well. So for us, quite fortunately, we have held our sponsorship license since 2018. So whilst it was the former tier 2 applications, we did gain a level of familiarity with the system to enable us to have quite a smooth transition to the skilled worker visas. Since this time, we have successfully sponsored 40 individuals. So just over half of these have joined us from the 1st of January under the new skilled worker route. Again, quite fortunately within this sector, we are recruiting at that higher skill level, PhD level, meaning we don't have to worry about reaching that 70-point threshold and can quite often make use of the tradable points. So it has differed throughout the year, but quite often our SOC occupation codes have been on the skilled shortage application list throughout the year. So moving on to the interviews and interviewing remotely. throughout COVID. So for us, prior to COVID, all of our UK and EU candidates would join us on site at Signature for a full face-to-face interview. And as a company, we would support financially in terms of their travel and accommodation and attending that interview. We did reserve an online format for rest of world candidates, where it might not have been quite as efficient to bring someone over from, say, India, China, Australia to the UK for a half a day interview. So we did fortunately have an online format, which when COVID hit in March 2020, we did roll that out across all of our scientific interviews and moved all of our interviews over Zoom. So there have been some efficiencies that we've seen in this process. Number one, so COVID did coincide with quite a big growth period for us. So we were having to interview a lot of candidates, and having all of our interviews online did enable us to have a bit of a quicker turnaround. So what we did find prior to COVID, especially candidates joining us for an interview from the EU, would quite often like to coincide their interview with maybe later on in the week, a Thursday, Friday, just so they can extend their stay, maybe see a bit more of the city that they might potentially move to, or also see family and friends that they have in the UK, which did limit the days that, say, we would interview. So now, yeah, we've definitely seen a quick turnaround in terms of inviting people to interview and them accepting that date, as they can just maybe book a half day off work. They don't need to think about being in the UK for a longer stay. And we've been able to get through a higher volume of interviews, which has really helped with the level of recruitment that we are seeing at the moment in our company. So moving on to relocation, there definitely have been impacts for candidates joining us from the EU and rest of world relocating to the UK throughout COVID. So linking to my last point, whereas it was quite nice when people were attending interviews, they could spend a bit of time in the city, get to know the areas. They could also, as part of their relocation package that we offer prior to relocating to the UK, upon accepting a position, they could make use of the relocation allowance to maybe fly over to the UK for a quick weekend or a short stay, view accommodation in person, and really vet that property before making a financial commitment to that property. So that's unfortunately been one side that has been slightly negative for us. Unfortunately, we have seen a few new starters organise their accommodation, their permanent accommodation, entirely remotely from the country that they're relocating from. Upon entering the UK, they've found out that the accommodation was not ready, and it would be a fair few months before they could move in and it would be ready. So the agency, the tenant agent, has offered them alternative accommodation a lot further away from the city, which we can appreciate being a new starter in a new country, a new city, and when you're going through an induction process at work, can be quite distressing to then having to travel a lot further into the city to attend work, but also going through the process of trying to gain a refund on the money that they've lost in that process. So what we have started to do, we have quite an extensive relocation guidance document. So we've listed any companies that those, unfortunately, our new starters have interacted with where they haven't had the best experience. But also we're encouraging starters from, say, the EU and rest of world to take up, essentially look at temporary accommodation for their first few weeks within the UK. So directing them to, say, Airbnb or apart hotels that we've used within the city that we would recommend, and then reclaiming that back from their relocation allowance, just to enable them to have that period of time where they can really settle into work, but also attend viewings in person before making that financial commitment to a permanent accommodation, just to make everything a bit smoother and a lot less stressful, hopefully, for them. One thing we also have looked at is the extra financial support that we do offer as a business through relocation, but also visa support. Number one, to make us a bit more attractive, but one thing we have looked at in a recent focus group is we've really been able to truly recognise the full costs that our new starters are going through in the visa application process. So we did prior offer a set amount to reclaim the direct cost of the visa, but we have increased this. Number one is we have really recognised the true costs that they are experiencing, but also it helps that employee in relocating. And also the government hotel quarantine. So as Alex mentioned, as a company, we do have to be aware of those relocating from red listed countries. So we have had quite a few new starters that have had to go through the government hotel quarantine. And in addition to their visa costs, it's quite a substantial financial burden moving over to the UK. So as a company, we've made the decision to cover the cost of the government hotel quarantine, which really does help that new starter avoid that 1,750 cost for the government hotel quarantines. And then lastly from me, and as Alex mentioned, we really need to be flexible as a company relocating in COVID times. So there are lots of unexpected changes. The nature of the work that we do, quite often new starters are going to be joining on a client project, maybe from day one or their first week. So it is really important that we keep the lines of communication open. If we do hear of, say, an extended quarantine due to an unfortunate negative COVID test or flights changing, we just make sure we keep in touch with the department heads so they can make the necessary arrangements within their department. And also if we do have to change, start dates. So yeah, just really important to be flexible relocating in COVID times.
Point on tenancy agencies there, it reminds me of one in particular employee that the agency that they had been using, and they found a property through, they decided that they'd had a new rule they put in place to help, I think, mitigate against what they felt was a less stable financial environment, where they were now asking for everyone to have a UK-based guarantor for their rent, which was a new addition and not one that we'd had an issue with before. That was especially infuriating for me because they didn't know anyone in the UK. They just moved to the UK to start a job with us, and the agency ended up putting some pressure on them to try and assign their own line manager as the guarantor, which obviously isn't a particularly sensible way to structure it, and one we had to steer very far clear of. But thankfully there were many other agencies that were willing to be more reasonable in that respect. But it was an unfortunate impact, I guess, of both how the pandemic has affected us, and also obviously Brexit in some way. Just a little bit then about retention. Obviously we prefer that no one left it away, and it sometimes feels a bit uncomfortable to admit that anyone would ever leave. But it is a fact of life, and it probably is healthy to have a little bit of turnover in the business. Normally we like to see it be less than 10% within a given year, but the year of the pandemic has seen it just push slightly over that for us. I think we want to be realistic about contemplating where the root cause of the decisions that employees are making may be coming from there, and what we can realistically do to combat that. One of the factors we have seen is an increase of people who have returned to the country that they originally came from. For us, most of that is people who are going back to Europe, and you end up making a connection to Brexit there ultimately. We tried to accommodate a little bit for people who have just wanted to spend more time with family. Obviously, one of the challenges is people who often come to somewhere like Signature in the UK because they expect that they can probably nip back to France, Germany, wherever else, with relative ease to see family at the weekend and things like that. They've just not been able to over the last year or so. And I think for lots of them, when we've spoken to them at ex-interviews and things like that, that's just become a real frustration without any clarity on when it'll be easy to do that again. And they felt that it's best if they just try and find something nearer home. We've tried to be supportive, we've tried to offer them a bit more flexibility in annual leave requests, and normally we'd be a bit more reluctant to have people take really long annual leave breaks of sort of more than 2 weeks or so, but this year, obviously, been a lot more flexible with that. So if you need to take the time off, you're going to need to probably isolate as well. So we'll be as supportive as we can with that, trying to keep in mind still the needs of our clients and trying to make sure that people aren't leaving big gaps on projects. We've even been able to get 1 or 2 people working abroad, but that's been difficult. As I mentioned, a lot of them are chemists, and they really have to be in the lab to make that work. Another interesting impact of the pandemic and what may have fed into the slight increase in turnover can be the different departments who have had to respond slightly differently to the restrictions on distancing. When you do get departments like chemistry, they've been doing different shifts. So some of them have come in quite early and some of them have finished quite late. And then if they look at one of the other departments that could more reasonably work from home, then you start seeing a little bit of that discontent there, where they're frustrated that other departments can do things differently from them, and they feel that maybe they've got it worse there. And we've tried to address that in a way, but we found ourselves in a slightly difficult situation where when things necessarily are slightly different for different groups of employees, it's very difficult to know what the proportionate response is to reassure some and possibly further reward some for doing things differently. We've gone some way to try and make sure people feel that extra level of value and appreciation for the inconveniences they're facing. But I think it's a situation where it's going to be very difficult to make everyone particularly happy, when really often they would have preferred to not have to do these things in the first place. And it's interesting that some employees have been very, very passionate about the importance of following the guidance to the very fullest interpretation of it, and other employees, I think, are a bit more dismissive perhaps of quite how important it is to maintain distancing at all times, and trying to reconcile those two groups of employees has been a challenge for us as well, especially as we step nearer to the point of relaxing some of those restrictions. We don't want to make the people who are very conscious of them feel like we now don't care about their opinions. There we go. I think the final thing which came up in my mind was the fact that normally when everyone's on site, everyone sees the management team a lot more often. And despite the fact that we've been able to use things like Zoom calls and other video technology, I do think there's probably a bit more of a disconnect between employees and management, because they've not had that same level of day-to-day interaction. And that is, again, possibly something which feeds into people deciding to leave if they don't know exactly what direction things are going in, or if they don't have that same level of engagement with the management team, which is, again, it's one that we've been trying to work on as much as possible, using those communication methods and trying to get more like employee forums together to share how they are feeling about things and to capture that information and act on it as much as we can. But I think it is just a necessary obstacle which we'll continue to grapple with for at least another month or two, I assume. That is all the content that we had to share. So we'll leave it there, but we're very happy to entertain any questions people might have, or indeed any solutions people might want to suggest for us. Would be lovely.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Michael and Kaushika. That's really insightful presentation to what your experiences have been so far, and the extra sort of considerations that you've had to sort of put in place. We do have a couple of questions that have dropped into the chat box, so I'll just go through these ones now. So the first question from Karen, do the graduate and temp worker visa routes require sponsorship or not? Is there any limit on how long post-uni grads have to be? Thank you. So Alex, did you want
Yeah, sure. So the graduate route, no, it doesn't require employer sponsorship. That's sort of the good news side of it. So the person needs to have been a student in the UK, have student leave, and then have completed their studies. If so, they apply for that leave, they get that leave, and then that enables them to work for any employer doing any role, up to 2 years if they're a bachelor's or master's student, or up to 3 years if they've done a PhD. So it's going to be a great option because you don't have that sponsorship side of things. The temporary worker route does require sponsorship in the context of this sector, so sort of universities, life sciences, businesses. Universities would obviously need to register as a temporary worker government authorised exchange sponsor, and indeed if you're a UKRI endorsed body, you can also get one of those licenses if you are a business doing that as well. The place to go to find out if that's possible probably would be to touch base with the UKRI, but you would need a license for the temporary worker route for sponsoring people. There are some temporary worker routes that people get off their own back and come into the UK. The most obvious one being what's called the Youth Mobility Visa, that enables younger people up to 30 to be able to come to the UK to work for up to 2 years. You might sometimes see somebody present that visa, but that's slightly different to the short-term supernumerary research roles that the government authorised exchange route covers, which I was talking about.
Thank you, Alex. I hope that helps. Karen, if not, you are free to unmute to ask for clarification. Just Alex, on that slide you presented actually with the different routes, there was a lot of options. Are there plans to bring any more in the future? And if so, where would attendees be able to get information on that?
Yes, I think there are going to be ones in the future. So, I mean, the routes that we've got have all been, significantly tweaked over the past few months. So if you just take the global talent route, that's been tweaked a number of times and probably will do again in the months ahead. So within those routes, there are quite regular changes that potentially might make quite a significant difference to the roles that you are recruiting into. And yeah, some of what I touched on towards the end around thinking about, a new sponsored route for highly skilled people, a global mobility visa to enable international businesses to move people around. That's all in the pipeline. The government gets advice from the Migration Advisory Committee on different routes, and I think definitely there will be more changes ahead, potentially. Well, I think largely positive, but also potentially, negative, depending on how things evolve. In terms of information, you can sign up to Home Office alerts, which give you the basics, or indeed. Plug Mills and Reeve, we have a great webinar series that we run of immigration updates. Sort of once every 4 months we run an update. Our next one's in July. There are other law firms and providers that do that as well. So I think it is an area where plugging into some webinars from people that or trust is a useful thing to do, because it's so fluid and so evolving, and it's easy to miss things. All sorts of changes can happen every 3 or 4 months that could be critical to a particular role that you are recruiting to.
Thank you. We'll have to make sure we're listing all of those webinars on the One Nucleus website, Alex. So members have multiple places they can go to sign up. Sounds good. There is another question from Karen. Maybe Michael Kaushika, this can go to you. So how straightforward is the process to apply for sponsorship?
So we obtained it in 2018. It was actually before I moved into, say, recruitment, but we did, Mike, I'm not sure if you can remember as well, we did have to give quite a bit of information about the company and reasons as to why we wanted to become a sponsor. And Alex, if you want to take it.
Yeah, I'm happy to chip in if that's useful. That's kind of the bread and butter of my daily work, I suppose, sponsor license applications. So on the face of it, they're relatively straightforward. It's an online application. The complexity tends to be in the detail of getting it right. So there are tricky aspects around making sure the documents you provide in support are correct, that you include the right information on the form in terms of what you need and want, that you cover all of your different sites and locations. If you get that wrong, you can run into quite serious problems further down the line. So yeah, I think it's something that will require, if you're doing it, to kind of set aside a good chunk of time for, think about carefully, pull together the documents quite carefully. It's not really sort of 10-15 minute kind of lazy Sunday afternoon job. And it might be something that sometimes it's helpful to get a view on, or indeed, as I say, plenty of people like ourselves, we can do the whole process end to end. And yeah, that's something that may be useful.
Excellent. Thank you, Alex. And I'm going to jump to Karen's next question, then we'll come back to Alison. So maybe again, Alex, Karen said, I'm guessing the global talent route is only suitable more for highly skilled leaders in the field rather than junior scientific roles.
No, not necessarily. So there are different ways you can be endorsed. So certainly the automatic endorsement for academic and research roles that people are employed in is for more senior roles, so kind of professorial reader, group leader, research type roles. But there are other ways that people can be endorsed. So for example, if somebody is a named researcher on a qualifying funding grant, for example, there is a way to get endorsed through that. People can be endorsed through being leading experts in their field, having a particularly great track record of publications and research. So there are a number of different options that can be looked at. It's not just about appointment to senior roles.
Excellent, thanks again. And this question from Alison will go, I think, Michael or Kaushika. So in terms of retention, are you finding that COVID has meant that staff are reevaluating their careers and perhaps looking for additional and different opportunities?
I think there's definitely an element of that. I think people have started talking about it in a more national context as well. But overall, more people are leaving and looking for, I guess, just reevaluating what they want to do with their lives in general, hoping that there'll be something more different and better. And the challenge for us is really to work out how much we could have control over and how much we could make it clear that there is a good opportunity to stay with the company. And thankfully, the vast majority of employees are still staying with us, but definitely pandemic has coincided with a slightly higher number of leavers.
Kaushika, did you want to add anything, or as Michael said it all?
That's the question that's come through about EU staff and working from home. We haven't. So the nature of what we do, so everyone we've recruited on a skilled worker visa is a scientist. So they do have to be lab-based. So can't comment on any issues that we've had sort of relocating, recruiting on a visa and working from home.
Alex, do you have any comments on that one, or?
No, I don't think so. No, nothing significant to add.
Excellent, thanks. So I did actually, Michael and Kaushika, one question I had thought of was during a virtual recruitment process, obviously it's a different environment than to being face to face. Are there more sort of pressures on the business to sort of, because we all know interviews are actually a two-way thing, aren't they? The candidate wants to impress, but also the business needs to kind of almost sell to the candidate. Do you find there's more pressure in that regard to kind of sell to the candidate, or is the dynamic the same?
The dynamic has changed. We have recently looked at this. So one aspect of our face-to-face interviews that was really useful was the tour. So we used to have a tour of the on-site facilities, and it would be quite an informal 15 minutes where outside of the more say pressurized section of the technical and discussion with senior management, the individual could maybe talk to one of our junior scientists about what it's really like to work at the company, what the day-to-day is like, and have a look around the lab. So yeah, what we have started to implement is a longer technical discussion with the added 15 minutes at the end of the technical discussion, where people can really ask informally, just have a bit of a chat about what it's like to work at the company. But I wouldn't say it's affected us too negatively. One thing that's come out of a focus group is that they really like candidates have really enjoyed the level of the technical discussion, and it really goes to show the level of the scientists that we have in the company, and really enjoy the challenge of the technical discussion. So you can still sell the company well throughout the interview, but it's just good to implement maybe a bit of time for an informal discussion where you can ask some questions that you wouldn't ask maybe to more senior members.
Thank you so much. So we've got a couple more questions coming in. So Tony has asked, so when reimbursing visa costs, quarantine hotels, etc., do employers attach any repayment clauses? The recruitment person then leaves in a relatively short time, as happens often when qualification courses are funded, for instance.
Yes, yeah, we do that. So we include it in the offer letter, and just make the individual aware that if they do leave at certain points within the 2 years following their starting with employment, they will be liable to pay back clauses.
Thank you. And then Caroline has asked, following on from Paul's question, what are the tax implications for EU workers working from their home? Alex is nodding on that one.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because I think lots of cans of worms have been opened up in this area off the back of COVID, where people have gone back to their home country and work remotely. You can end up in quite a difficult situation there if you don't work the issues through. So potentially, you could end up having to, register for payroll in that country. There could be obligations to be dealing with employment-related taxes. Certainly, social security contributions are equivalent in that country, or be applying for certificates to confirm reciprocal arrangements. You could also, if somebody is in a more senior role or a revenue-generating role, or has authorities in certain areas, you could end up generating corporate tax liability in that country linked to what's called sort of permanent entity or permanent establishment risk. There are questions around, what about local law rights? If somebody is working overseas for any material period, they're probably going to benefit from employment law rights in whichever country that's in. Are you meeting those requirements? Potentially there are issues around data transfers, cross-border and data protection issues, and some other around insurance as well. So do you have appropriate insurance in place? Do your existing employment-related insurances cover people who are working abroad? So it is a bit of a can of worms. I think you have to take a bit of a risk-based analysis approach to it. And a very rough general rule of thumb: the longer somebody is based abroad, the higher up the risk register it should go. But not always, as I say. Some of those issues sort of bite from day one. I think the key practical point is to have a handle on who's going abroad, a process to make sure it's properly signed off, not just done by a line manager without going back through HR. And if it's happened that people have ended up abroad, you don't know how many, to do some sort of audit of who we've got, where are they, what are they doing, how long have they been there for, putting that information together and thinking, do we need to bottom out those issues and risks and get some advice on that. If you are in that situation, I would add, you're not alone. A lot of employers are working those issues through at the moment.
Thanks, Alex. One question I had thought of in advance actually was around sort of hidden charges associated with hiring EU employees. Are there any sort of areas you can highlight for employers in terms of where there's maybe not as much clarity and then they find out later on? Do
you want me to pick that up? Or, yeah.
Yes, if that's yeah.
I think sometimes there can be a misconception on the costs associated with getting people in on visas. So sponsorship costs are not as high as they might first appear. So you have a fee for a certificate of sponsorship of 199, but that doesn't actually apply to EU nationals, only to sort of rest of the world nationals. For some roles, there's an immigration skills charge up to £1,000 a year, unless essentially you're a charity. But there are lots of exemptions to that. So lots of the sort of science-based roles and academic and research roles, there's no immigration skills charge payable. And those are essentially the employer costs. So they're not necessarily that significant. You've obviously got the costs that the applicant has around the health surcharge, the immigration application fees, the quarantine stuff that was mentioned, and then you've got a commercial call as a business. Do we want to elect to reimburse that as signatures being, has said that's what they do, for example, but that's your decision, commercial call for you to make. So they're not as bad as sometimes people might imagine. I don't know whether Michael or anybody else has got something to add on that, really.
No, it's just as you said. I think it's a decision as a business if you want to reimburse visa costs, and also how much. Quite expensive if people are coming over with a family as well. So whether you'd consider reimbursing costs for families, or I think it's more of a business decision. But there's no hidden costs outside of what Alex has mentioned that we've experienced.
One thing I'll very quickly add, which I've been asked a number of times, is can you sort of refuse to sponsor people for roles that qualify if you don't want to because of the costs, particularly given there's a wider range of roles that are open to sponsorship? The short answer to that, the very short answer is if you do that, it's going to be indirect race, nationality discrimination. The question is, can you objectively justify it? The answer is very likely you won't be able to, based on the cost and administration issues, which is essentially why you were deciding not to sponsor. So if you decided not to for a role that qualifies and that person is the best person for the role, you have got that potential risk exposure.
Great. So I think we're up to time now. I just want to say thank you very much, Alex, Kaushika and Michael, for taking time out to present and answer questions. And thank you to the audience for your comments and your questions as well. We hope you found the session informative. So I will distribute a copy of the recording in the post-event follow-up. And if there were any other comments or questions, then you can pass those on at that point. And I'm very happy to link you up with any of the speakers today if that can help. So with that, I hope everyone has a good rest of the day. And that's all from us. So take care and thanks for joining. Thank you.